Good afternoon everyone. I'm here today to present Team Brief for December, which will cover some of the key and important details of the Trust performance, but also update staff on some of the topics that I suspect most people will be interested in. As always, I'm going to begin with a brief update of where we are with COVID-19, and particularly the number of patients we've treated and remain in hospital. As of yesterday afternoon, we had 153 patients who were in hospital and were actively suffering from COVID infections. Thankfully, since the last Team Brief, the number of patients who retire in intensive care has fallen slightly, and we currently have 9 patients who are receiving intensive care, although we still have a number of patients who are up on the respiratory units who are receiving non-invasive ventilation, which is oxygen under pressure, which is one of the standard treatments now for COVID-19. In terms of patients who recovered, we've successfully discharged 1,340 patients to date, but very sadly, 551 patients have actually succumbed to COVID-19 and passed away. In terms of total number of patients year to date, we've treated 2,092, and as people will be aware, that means that the second wave of COVID has brought into hospital more patients than at any point during the first wave of the pandemic. And clearly it's really important that we maintain that focus, because we want to try to reduce as much as possible the number of patients who require hospital care over the coming months. From the change between November Team Brief to December Team Brief, people will be aware that it is a slightly less challenging position than it was, but it clearly remains challenging. And one of the areas that is of most concern to us is that, unlike Wave 1, where the number of patients began to fall quite sharply after the initial pressures, during Wave 2 the numbers are falling very gradually, and if anything are actually flatlined at the moment in terms of the number of admissions each day from COVID-19 now keeping pace with the number of discharges, which is why we're not seeing a fall off in the total numbers. And clearly that's a concerning position as we move through to the Christmas and New Year period, where we are looking to the measures that are being introduced to help to control the transmission in the local communities to try to ease the pressure on hospital services in January. The national lockdown has now ended, and South Yorkshire and Bassetlaw is in Tier 3 of the new measures, which is a position that reflects the pressures not just on the hospital but also on the number of people testing positive in the communities. And that's why it is really important that we maintain the efforts towards hands, face and space, which until we have secured and inoculated the majority of the population is the best way in which we keep this terrible virus under a degree of control. We continue to concentrate our bed and testing capacity on managing the pandemic, and obviously we're putting steps in place now to manage through the Christmas period and into the early part of January. And obviously all efforts are going into trying to reduce pressure on the hospital and its services, which does mean that unfortunately at the moment we're not able to offer a full range of elective operations. We remain concentrated on Priority 1 emergency patients, Priority 2 urgent patients and cancer services, and clearly if we do have any capacity beyond that, we're dealing with patients in date order who need a treatment as a result of the fact that they may deteriorate without that treatment in the next week or two. We continue to make every effort to continue with the diagnostic services, and obviously the restoration of those services is important to many patients, and we've seen significant improvements in the number of patients who are able to get MRI, CT, ultrasounds and those sorts of tests that either reassure or help with diagnosis, and our intention is to try to continue those through the coming months. However, we clearly have much more optimism. It's a really great position to be in respect of the vaccine. We now have more than one vaccine available to the NHS, and in the next few weeks we think that the vaccine availability will increase to the point where the majority, if not all, of the trusts in England will be able to start vaccinations. At the current timeline, we believe that we will have vaccine at Doncaster Royal Infirmary in the early part of January, and that will supplement the vaccines that have been made available to Sheffield teaching hospitals to start the programme with vulnerable and extremely vulnerable patients. Doncaster Bassett Law patients have benefited from that, but clearly it's a huge advantage to have it locally, because that will allow us to move quickly into vaccination of our staff. We will do that in the order dictated by the government advice and measures, but it's likely we will be able to start a vaccination programme for staff, particularly staff who are working in the high-risk areas, in the January period. Like all vaccines, it is a big step forward. Clearly some people will be concerned because it's a new vaccine, but we have every faith in the MHRA to make sure the safety tests have been done and that the vaccine is safe to use. When my term comes, I will absolutely get the vaccine because I think it is a major step forward in returning hospital and the country to the sorts of lives that we all want to live next year, rather than the very, very difficult year we've had as 2020. Again, it's really, really important that internally we also observe all of those really high quality infection prevention and control measures, because again, that's the best way we're going to protect our patients, but more importantly ourselves, our colleagues and our family members. But I know this has been a really, really challenging period for everyone. I think 2020, I've said before, is the most challenging period of my whole professional life, my nursing career, and I would express absolute gratitude to you all on behalf of myself, the board of directors, the executive team, for your constant hard work and effort through this challenging time, and actually for your effort that I know we are going to have to put in this next month or two whilst we hopefully see the third and final wave of this pandemic come to an end. In terms of our operational activity, the details will be in the written team brief, but suffice to say that we continue to undertake as much elective activity, as much diagnostic, as much cancer activity as we can safely do. And in most respects, certainly diagnostics and cancer are at the pre-pandemic levels. Some of the elective work is delayed at the moment by the effects of the pandemic, but as soon as we're able, we're wanting to restore those services to reduce some of those waiting times. The details, as I said, are in the full written team brief if people are interested in things like the performance in ED, the HSMR and otherwise. The numbers are there for people to peruse at their leisure. We've had a very solid month in terms of finances. We have moved slightly to a new contract arrangement for the second half of the year, but as a result of that and as a result of a reduction in spend in some areas, we've ended the month with a favourable position to plan of 1.6 million. What people may be aware of is that there were some issues related to that which related to elective activity, where we could see income removed as a result of not restoring elective activity. If that were to happen, then that position would be slightly changed. But at the moment, because of the pressures, there's no indication nationally that that money would be withdrawn from the trust. So at the moment, it's an optimistic position as we move into the second half of the winter period. Throughout December, we began the distribution of the lateral flow tests. We were initially limited by the amount of stock that was being received because this was a rollout that was nationwide and obviously all trusts were receiving some stock. We continue to receive additional lateral flow kits, and the expectation is that as stock allows, all members of staff will be given access to the test. The one thing we ask of people is that they do fill their results in online, because a measure of the success of this programme will be that the majority of people are undertaking it, but obviously the number of kits are associated to the number of returns we make. So if it's felt that centrally we're only returning 2,500 test results each week, then the expectation is we only need 2,500 kits. Well, in reality, we've got nearly 6,500 staff, so the more staff that fill in the test results, the more kits we'll get to allocate to everybody else. So please take the extra effort to fill in your results, and as soon as stock becomes available, we'll extend it to all staff, not just the starting point, which was the frontline clinical services. To date, we've issued 5,052 test kits, so we're well on the way. I think that's 82% of the people who would like to receive them. So a short effort in the next week or two should mean that everybody has access to the kits during this winter period. The actual work itself, it's been a monumental task to actually set up a system to distribute the kit, to organise for staff to have access to videos and training, and to set up the the recording system. So I'd like to express thanks to colleagues in the service improvement team and in the IT team and our HR teams, and more widely for the work that's been undertaken to get this off the ground so quickly. People may be aware that the government issued further and updated guidance that meant that the actual isolation period could be reduced to 10 days, and that's been accepted and adopted by the Trust. Full details, as always, are on the Hive. We've also had a relatively successful flu campaign, so really big thank you to people who've had the flu vaccine this year. If anything, it's the most important year ever to get the flu vaccine, because what we definitely don't want to see is that we have a flu outbreak at the end of the COVID outbreak, because that would be a significant change in our pressures, and we definitely want to avoid that. So there is still chance for people to get the vaccine if they wish to have it, and actually that would allow us to safely move into the period of vaccination beginning of January for COVID vaccine. As many people know, we're going to offer it in a vaccination hub rather than being able to move around wards to give it, and that's related to the way in which the vaccine has to be stored, thawed and distributed. Should we get access to some of the more stable vaccines who don't need that degree of storage, then we clearly will update our vaccination programme to reflect the ability to be a bit more flexible with the way in which we administer the vaccine. But we will have mass vaccination centres open, I think, from the point in January and receive the vaccine, making it available probably 8 at least every day of the week, so that the vast majority of our staff can get vaccinated as quickly as possible. And as I said, so look out for information relating to that in the early part of January, when we do think the vaccine will start to be available to us. Hopefully people have had an opportunity to see the Christmas stars, which I think are a great way of recognising the year that we've had in terms of a shining light for the future, being really, really supported by our communities. I had a really thoughtful letter this week from 3 local children who live close to DRI, who, whilst they welcomed the stars, wrote to me asking when the Santa on top of the children's block would be arriving this year, because they'd noticed that it actually wasn't illuminated, and our estates team will manage to have a look at the Santa and have resolved the problem, and so Santa has arrived. And I wrote back to the children just to say that unfortunately it has been a challenging year, and Santa had been delayed a little bit by the pandemic, but he would be here shortly, and hopefully now they've been able to gaze up at both stars and Santa, and it gave them a bit of Christmas festivity and spirit in what has been a really challenging period for us. Been a huge success with our community, because people will remember that one of the purposes of the stars were for families and members of staff to reflect upon the people who had been lost during the pandemic, and a number of the stars were sponsored either by large companies locally, but also by individuals and individuals' families, just to reflect on the people that had sadly passed as a result of this. But also it's a major contribution to the Trust funds. In terms of other key points, this month seen the appointment of our new Equality, Diversity, Inclusion lead, Kaban Hussain, who likes to be known as Kirby. Really, really important post, and I really do wish Kirby well, and I hope you will all extend that huge greeting to him, because really important agenda that we address really, really powerfully this year. In terms of other things, I want to congratulate digital transformation team and procurement team, as well as Alicia Whitehead and Tracy Johnson. All have been nominated this month for awards, and we wish them all the very best of luck in terms of hopefully securing those awards once the judgments have taken place. The final thing really to say before we end Team Brief is that the really, really important thing, I think, during the next period of time is that our communities try in some ways to celebrate Christmas, and that includes all of our staff, but to do so in as safe a way as possible, because what we actually don't want to do is to see that the Christmas period accelerates the transmission of the virus and causes further distress, pain, upset and pressure in the immediate New Year period. So I would encourage everybody to try the best to enjoy Christmas and the New Year, but to try to do so in a safe way. One of the things we would also encourage our communities to do is to ensure that during this period they use all of the services wisely, and particularly the emergency department and the hospital services. and to be aware ahead of the Christmas period of the types of community-based services that they can access if they are feeling poorly or they've got questions or they need medication, rather than coming to hospital and using our services at what is likely to be a very, very busy time for us. Finally, I would like to express, as I did in the middle of the briefing, an absolute sense of pride, an absolute sense of gratitude, and huge thanks from me, from the board of directors, from the executive team, from our governors, and also from our local communities for the absolute hard work, dedication, and the way in which all of our staff have risen to the challenge of 2020. I'm absolutely sure that we're all really, really pleased that 2020 is about to end, and we can look forward with some sense of optimism to 2021 being the year in which we return ourselves, our families, our communities, and the country to a normal position as quickly as possible, so that actually next Christmas we can have the type of festivities, the type of relationships and meetings with our families that we would all wish to have today. But our hard effort this year won't be in vain if we manage to get through the next period of time safely and we get that vaccine distributed to as many staff as possible, and we back that up with testing. So absolute major, massive thank you to me, to every single member of staff, and I wish you all the very best for Christmas, and I wish you all the very best for a happy and COVID-free 2021. Thank you very much. As always, I'll now turn to answer questions from members of staff that have been posed as part of Team Brief this month. I've just indicated in Team Brief that the initial challenge with lateral flow tests was the availability of the test kits themselves. The kits were prioritised by the government in terms of the areas which we had to distribute first. Those areas were clearly the frontline staff who were dealing with the patients on a day-to-day basis. As the stock levels increase, and we've received recently a further batch of lateral flow tests to allocate, we've currently allocated 5,052 kits. We need to allocate probably about 7,200 in total, but as they come on stream, we will be giving them to every single member of staff who wishes to have one. The thing that we do ask is that when people get the kit, that they actually then report the results, because that's one of the measures by which we receive the test kits, is that staff are using them for the purpose that they're intended. So the short answer is yes. Once we give them to you, please fill in the test results on the system that's described on Hive. The answer to this question is really related to the availability and sometimes the specialism that we're trying to actually cover at short notice. One of the challenges we have is that we work in a system, and therefore our pay rates have to be comparable to the other trusts in South Yorkshire. So in some areas, what we did agree to do where it was very difficult to fill the shifts at short notice was to offer enhancements, and those enhancements are reflective of staff availability and the pressures that the service are under. Those areas are kept under constant review, and where necessary, the enhancement applies to all sorts of different types of staff. And particularly if we are short of healthcare assistants in certain areas, it would apply to healthcare assistants. If we're short of qualified nurses, it would apply to qualified nurses. If we're short of both, it would apply to both. The short answer is it reflects the pressures that the service is under, and it maintains our competitiveness with our partners across South Yorkshire. The vaccine comes in batches of 975 vials, and therefore every day it's really, really important that the vaccine isn't wasted. So there was some opportunity to vaccinate extremely vulnerable members of staff, and some of staff in Doncaster and Bassetlaw were able to and have been able to go to Sheffield to receive the vaccine. What we expect to happen is that in January, the availability of COVID vaccine, maybe from AstraZeneca as well as Pfizer, will increase significantly, and all hospitals are planning to start vaccination of frontline workers from the 4th of January onwards. Clearly that is dependent upon the vaccine arriving, and as everybody would anticipate, it's in huge demand across the world, so supply is restricted by demand, but we are of the understanding that we will get some vaccine beginning in January, and we've set our service up to be able to deliver the Pfizer vaccine, which does require the special storage that people will have seen on TV perhaps, with the special fridges. But then we will begin to see the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is a much more stable vaccine, and that will then allow us to be much more proactive in the delivery to staff in different areas. So from January, first week in January, we have got provision in place to start. We'll start as soon as the vaccine's available to us. We will have to follow the government guidance in terms of what the priority areas are, but as we address the priority areas, we will then expand it so that every single member of staff will have the opportunity to consider the vaccine. In terms of is it compulsory? No, the vaccine is not compulsory. Staff will have the choice. From a personal perspective, I'm getting mine as soon as I'm eligible, because I think it is the right thing to do to protect myself, to protect my colleagues, to protect my family, and to protect patients that I come into contact with. As other vaccines, I believe it is safe. The MHRA, who do the assessment for ourselves in England, have a national, international reputation for safety. I do not believe that they will have cut any corners. I think it is safe for us to have, and I will be having mine, and I would encourage every single member of staff to really think about it and to actually take the plunge and take the vaccine, so that we can get to the point where the country then can begin to return to some sense of normality. The short answer is yes. We made provision in the early part of the pandemic for leave because, as people know, we restricted leave for quite a period of time as a result of needing to deal with the first wave of the pandemic. What we would say though is that leave and rest and time to actually recuperate from some of the physical and mental demands of the pandemic mean that we would encourage staff wherever possible to take leave. But clearly there will be some situations where that isn't possible, and what the provision allows for is that staff can take forward up to 20 days through 2 annual leave periods to make sure that they don't lose the leave or suffer detriment as a result of their hard efforts during the pandemic. There is also a sub-provision in certain circumstances where if staff don't feel that they want to carry the leave forward, they can approach managers for the leave to be purchased, and obviously that would mean that if you wanted to give up 5 days of the 20, then there's an opportunity to give those up and they would be paid for at your normal working rate, and clearly that would mean that you would carry 15 forward instead of 20. So those options are also available to all members of staff. The next question relates to areas of the trust that may not be currently being used that were previously wards or departments, and would it be sensible to use those departments which do have oxygen to care for patients? The challenge really with wards and departments as extra wards and departments is that one of the major problems we face is actually staffing levels and being able to staff areas as safely as possible. What we want to do is to limit the number of beds and additional beds we have open, because that in itself creates an additional stress and a pressure for staff. So what we're doing at the moment is trying to minimise our bed base to the amount that's needed to care for the patients without stretching the staff to caring for other areas. Clearly at times we've come under pressure. When we come under pressure, it's really important that the areas we open are co-located to other wards, so that actually that ability to manage across floors or landings or within buildings is maximised. And it's not the intention to diversify from that by opening areas that are not necessarily associated to care of patients at the moment and or would give us problems in terms of forward staffing those units. We have lost beds this year as a result of the infection control practices, so the beds are tighter this year than they were in previous years. So the bed position is kept under almost daily review in terms of what is the safest and most sensible and sustainable way forward when additional capacity is needed. But the overarching principle would be not to open additional capacity wherever possible to try to make sure that wards and departments aren't overstretched. The next question relates to home working, the availability of home working and particularly the availability of IT. One of the challenges is that when we have COVID patients and the numbers that we have currently, some areas of the trust, some departments are under huge and enormous pressure. And we designed a framework and some guidance for managers that determined the request for home working in the context of ensuring that all of the areas that are currently caring for COVID patients had the right staff in place to be able to do so. And that included admin and clerical staff for things like ward receptions and admin type duties. So the first thing manager has to do is to make an assessment of whether the person who wants to work at home is doing work that is absolutely essential to that frontline response to the pandemic. If it is, then actually that request could be considered. However, if that work is not absolutely essential to the trust and to the COVID response, then managers are asked to consider what other roles and responsibilities staff could undertake to make sure the areas that are dealing with COVID patients and are dealing with the pressures created from COVID have the opportunity to be as well staffed as possible. The next question relates to the Nightingale hospitals. At what point would we use the Nightingale hospitals and how would we staff those facilities? In previous team briefs I've talked about the Nightingale hospitals and particularly the one that serves South Yorkshire and Bassetlaw, which is based at the Harrogate Convention Centre. During the Phase 1 pandemic, the Nightingale Centre in Harrogate was established to care for critical care patients. So the facilities were designed for patients who were on ventilators. And obviously that's very, very different for ward-based care. During the first wave of the pandemic, the way in which we treated patients who then subsequently would have gone on to intensive care was developed. We had a lot of learning, we had a lot of opportunity to see the way in which patients responded to treatment. We added in things like dexamethasone, which appeared to reduce complications. And what that's meant in wave 2 is that the number of patients who actually need intensive care has reduced by about half across the country. And so the demand and the pressure, whilst it's been significant on intensive care, it hasn't exceeded the actual capacity that was available in the system. The biggest pressure has been on staffing because the beds were there, but the staff are under significant pressure. And obviously the challenge is to match a bed to staff and therefore provide a safe service. As a result of that, the Nightingale's intended purpose to provide critical care support, particularly in face of the challenge in critical care around staffing, was not going to be as successful or as helpful for second and third wave as if the facility itself could care for a wide range of patients. The Nightingale was used for things like diagnostic tests because it had MRI and CT scanners in place to be able to help with the care of critical care patients. So it was used for diagnostics, particularly in West Yorkshire and the Leeds area, where patients felt easier and more comfortable in travelling to the Harrogate Centre for those types of tests. Since wave 1, it's been adapted slightly and is now available to support ward-based type patients, patients who may need rehab. But the main challenge remains in that the area itself would need to be staffed. It doesn't have a dedicated workforce. The workforce would need to be drawn from the trusts. So as a result of that, it has to be there in reserve if and when the absolute capacity of the NHS is being reached and actually about to be breached. Because what we would have to do collectively as the region is identify staff who could work in the Nightingale Centre to care for those patients. That wouldn't just be hospital staff, it would be community staff, it would be mental health staff, it would be GP practice staff, because at this point, all of the hospital-based staff would be caring for hospital care and the patients that we have in our buildings. So the Nightingales are reserved, they're reserved for a very, very difficult position, but it is there as a safety net that we could use, but with that codicil is that the health and social care community would have to come together to provide the necessary staffing to make sure that the patients who are transferred there are getting the right care and that they're safe and actually their treatment is progressing. From my perspective and based upon the information that's available to me, I have a huge degree of optimism and confidence in respect of the impact that the vaccine is going to make in the early part of 2021. I also have optimism that the flow testing and the availability and the capacity of our testing will supplement the vaccines to enable us to get on top of very early any outbreaks in terms of the transmission of COVID-19. I think that it will be a month or two before we can get the vaccination and the vaccine numbers up to a point where we've got the majority of our population vaccinated, and therefore we can get to the point where we can return the country to the normality that we all are hoping and wishing for. But I genuinely believe that that will be in place in the first quarter, and therefore by the end of the first quarter, when spring is about to hit and the weather is about to improve and people have access to get out and about a little bit more in the open air, that we would then be able to see with confidence that the third and final wave has been passed and we now as a country are moving to that return to normality. So I have a huge sense of optimism for second quarter onwards that actually we will see that bounce back, we will see the recovery of the country, we'll see the real recovery, we'll be able to start to plan holidays, we'll be able to think about something more than COVID-19, and we will be able to get some of those issues and challenges dealt with